What does Snow White have to do with Romanticism, Jesus, and medieval torture? This week, I'm reading Snow White in its original German as part of my summer curriculum on German fairy tales, where I take one tale a week and read it as part of my language practice, and then explore the history and symbolism behind it with you. I'm curious about the differences between this version and the Disney one that I watched as a child. I do know some of the darker details already, but I've never actually read the tale in full, so we'll see if there are more that I'm not aware of. And after I read it, I'll begin my study of it. In this video, we'll use the tale of Snow White as a doorway into the wider world of German culture. We'll explore how the forest was such a powerful symbol during German Romanticism, and we'll have a look at the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, explore what the wicked stepmother, innocent heroine, and poisoned apple reveal about fairy tale symbolism, and uncover what Snow White's pretty messed up ending can tell us about medieval and early modern ideas of punishment in Germany. By the end of the video, we'll have a little cluster of connections, a richer cultural context of the tale, hopefully as though we have walked through a mini exhibition of Snow White. And then we'll end with a trip to a deer park, which I thought would be quite fitting, seeing as the tale is so often associated with woodland creatures and nature. So first I opened up the Grimm's Tale on my iPad and started reading in German. This version begins with Snow White's mother sewing by an ebony wood-framed window, who pricks her finger with a needle, whereby drops of blood fall into the snow outside. Looking at it, she then wishes for a daughter as white as the snow, as red as the blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame. And soon after, Snow White is born and her mother dies. Into the picture steps the evil queen and her magic mirror, who tells her one day that she is no longer the fairest in the land, as the 7-year-old Snow White is 1,000 times more fair than she, saying, Frau Königin, ihr seid die Schönste hier, aber Schneewittchen ist 1000-mal schöner als ihr. The queen then grows so envious that she orders a huntsman to kill the child in the forest and bring back her lungs and liver as proof. But he can't bring himself to do it, and after Snow White begs him to let her go, promising to never return home, he lets her run away and brings the queen back the organs of a young boar instead. Believing them to belong to her stepdaughter, the queen has them cooked with salt and eats them. Meanwhile, little Snow White runs deeper and deeper into the forest, until she stumbles upon a cottage and soon after meets the 7 dwarfs who live there, who offer her a place to stay in exchange for helping with the cooking and housekeeping. But once the queen finds out that Snow White still lives, she then tries to murder her herself 3 separate times, disguised as an old woman. Once with bodice laces that she pulls so tightly that Snow White can no longer breathe. Once with a poisoned comb that causes Snow White to faint. And once with a poisoned apple where she finally succeeds. When the dwarfs find her dead, they make her a coffin of glass and place it on a mountain where they guard it themselves, and where animals of the forest come to mourn the dead child. She lies there for a long, long time, years, never wasting away, but appearing as though asleep, still beautiful as ever, until one day a prince comes along, sees the now young woman, and asks the dwarfs to gift her to him, as he can't live without her, which is a bit creepy, but whatever. And as the dwarfs carry the coffin on their shoulders, they trip, the coffin shakes, the poisonous apple piece falls out of Snow White's mouth, and she comes back to life. They soon marry, and at the wedding the queen is punished as she is made to wear red-hot iron shoes and dance in them until she dies. And that's the end of the tale. This one was a little longer than the other 3 I read so far, and also the most different to the version that I grew up with, so it was perhaps the most challenging tale to get through, although definitely still manageable and enjoyable. There was some repetition in the narrative, with the queen returning again and again to try to kill Snow White, which made for a good reading experience, since the recurring words and phrases helped reinforce the German. As always, I highlighted words and phrases for later study, and once I had finished the tale, then moved on to my exploration of it. The first thing I was curious about was the forest in the story, as the children in all the tales that I've read so far seem to have gone through some sort of process of change once they're in it. For example, Red Riding Hood learns to be more careful and vigilant of her surroundings. The children in Hansel and Gretel learn to fend for themselves. And Snow White learns how to make allies and take on responsibilities like housework. The forest becomes this space where the children enter naive and unexperienced, confront some sort of danger, and leave somehow changed or transformed. This connects with the cultural and artistic movement of the time in which the Grimm tales were first published, Romanticism. Romantic artists and writers saw the forest as a wild and mysterious place that contrasted the order and rigidity of civilization. It was a symbolic landscape where people could experience the sublime through the vastness of nature. As mentioned in the Hansel and Gretel video, the sublime was an important concept in Romanticism that refers to the sense of awe we feel in the presence of something so immense and powerful that it overwhelms us. We see this idea of nature depicted as vast, mysterious, and awe-inspiring in the works of painter Caspar David Friedrich. For example, in this one, which you might recognize, a man stands above a sea of fog, facing this vast landscape of mountaintops. In this one, a tiny monk is overwhelmed by the surrounding sea and sky. And in this one, another tiny figure is engulfed by the dense and dark, intimidating forest that he peers into. And so this idea of the forest being a space that one could enter to experience something so profound complements its role in the fairy tales as a space of transformation in some way. In Snow White's case, the forest marks her transition from childhood to young adulthood, where she learns responsibility in caring for the dwarfs and ultimately survives the dangers set before her by the evil queen. And this wicked stepmother and Snow White as an innocent heroine were the next details that I wanted to have a look at. From my video on Hansel and Gretel, we already know that the wicked stepmother, much like the figure of the witch, acts like an inversion of the maternal ideal. Rather than being nurturing and protective towards the children like a mother should be, rather than sheltering them and feeding them, the wicked stepmother abandons them, endangers them, sometimes even tries to feed on them herself. These cannibalistic female figures in fairy tales have been described as Menschenfresserinnen, a fun mouthful of a German word that means devourer of humans. Menschenfresserinnen. And I think it's interesting to note that in some of the Grimm's tales, the stepmother was originally written as the biological mother. But in order to preserve the sanctity of motherhood, the brothers Grimm chose to split the identity of these maternal figures into good, idealized mother and bad, threatening intruder. In contrast to the wicked stepmother figure, the innocent heroine represents purity. She's defined less by direct action or physical strength than by endurance and patience and relative stillness, sometimes even becoming a motionless object of display, as Snow White is in her glass coffin. She is often so good and morally pure that she becomes vulnerable to danger and evil, and so we have this struggle between good and bad that is found in so many fairy tales, and is seen so effectively when Snow White bites into this poisoned apple and falls dead. And so we move on to our next connection, exploring the symbolism behind that apple. The apple is connected to the Christian tradition as the forbidden fruit, a symbol of forbidden knowledge, temptation, and the fall from innocence. Artistic depictions of Adam and Eve up until the 12th century featured a variety of fruits, including figs and pomegranates. But by the 13th century, the apple had become the dominant representation. This tradition reached its height in the works of Northern Renaissance artists, including the Germans Albrecht Dürer and Lucas Cranach the Elder, whose influential images, amongst others, firmly established the apple within the Christian imagination. Then, in late medieval art, we see it once again in a different scene, in the hand of Christ, to show how he has come to redeem humanity of original sin. We can see this in works such as this one by Martin Schongauer, this one by Lucas Cranach, and this one by Albrecht Dürer. In Snow White, however, the queen uses the very same fruit in the opposite way. Rather than pointing towards redemption, as in depictions of Christ, she turns it into a weapon. More like the serpent in the Garden of Eden, later understood in Christian tradition to be the devil in disguise, the queen masks her true identity too, and tempts innocent Snow White with the apple as the serpent does to Eve, persuading her to take a bite, after which she too suffers a terrible consequence. But once she is awake again and marries the prince, ready to live happily ever after, it's the queen who suffers the consequence of her actions next, in the form of torture, leading us to our last connection, exploring medieval and early modern torture in Germany, where ideas of justice were often inseparable from public punishment. Torture and execution were spectacles often held in the public square for everybody to see, designed to punish wrongdoing, but also to restore moral order by showing what happens to those who commit crimes, often in a deliberately theatrical way. Criminals might be broken on the wheel, have their limbs torn off, be hanged and left hanging for days and days, or be burnt at the stake like so many of those convicted of witchcraft were. Those thought to be witches were also tortured using the strappado, in which the accused was suspended by the arms tied behind the back and then dropped suddenly to dislocate the shoulders. Daumenschrauben, or thumb screws, were also used to crush the fingers, and in some cases even the rack was used, a device that stretched the body to extreme pain, causing dislocated joints and muscle damage. I couldn't find any evidence that hot iron shoes were used as torture devices in real life, but apparently something called a foot press existed in Germany, made up of a pair of iron plates that would be cranked tightly together with a foot placed in between in order to crush it. Resembling these public spectacles of justice, the Queen's punishment is also carried out for everyone to see, humiliating and agonizing, and restoring moral order in the tale. That just as Snow White's innocence is rewarded, the Queen's cruelty is condemned. So now I've read the original tale of Snow White in German, and alongside that we have a handful of connections, using the tale as a starting point to understanding the wider world of German fairy tales, cultural history, and art. From Snow White, we've explored German Romanticism through the symbolism of the forest, Christian art through the poisoned apple, recurring figures in folklore like the wicked stepmother and innocent heroine, and historical ideas of justice through the Queen's final punishment. I think what I really like about studying fairy tales in this way is seeing how each one becomes less simply a children's story and more like the main object in a little exhibition, supported by other interesting and relevant objects that draw from history, literature, religion, art, folklore, whatever it is. And so these tales become much more sort of representative of a wider world and carry more meaning. And having that sort of curiosity for these connections is a big part of what motivates me to keep learning German, keep engaging with German art, keep reading German stories. The next of those, by the way, will be Rapunzel, another story that, like Snow White, will be set mainly in the forest. And with that in mind, I thought I would end this video with a few clips from a trip to a beautiful country park. After reading about the forest in these tales, I wanted to spend some time in nature myself and take you with me. So here we go, and I'll see you in the next video.